Good morning. We're going to talk today a little bit about the story of King John and the Magna Carta. And this Magna Carta is this document that was written 800 years ago. And the document known as the Magna Carta, that's Latin for Great Charter. And later on we're going to talk about unintended consequences. And I don't think anybody in 1215 knew that this document was going to grow into one of the most important legal documents ever. That would not only influence English law, but also our U.S. judicial system as well. Well, if you recall, we talked a little bit about Henry II. Well, Henry had two sons. The person you see on your screen here is known as Richard. Richard became king of England when Henry dies in 1189. Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart or Lionhearted, spent almost the entire 10 years of his reign away from England. So he's fighting in the Crusades, he's fighting in tournaments. So he was kind of an absentee lord there, as you would say. He was very rarely home. To Richard, to pay for these little excursions, he needed money, and the way he was going to get that money was by taxing his subjects. Now, normally you would say, "Oh, well, people are going to complain," but Richard, on the other hand, Richard had charisma. Now, he was one of those people that he could get his way, and by simply saying something or acting a certain way, and people would fall into line, and they would rarely complain. And so, Richard raises the taxes, and really nobody complains because, well, they love Richard. Now, on the other hand, you have his brother. Now, when Richard dies in 1199, John becomes king, and unlike his brother, John tended to stay at home and run his kingdom on a day-to-day basis. On the surface, that doesn't sound like a bad idea, but the problem with John was, well, first of all, he had an inferiority complex. He never could live up to Richard's uh, personality, and as a result, John was very nasty. John was a mean guy. Okay, John pretty much did whatever he pleased to whomever he wanted to do that to. So if he didn't like you, he would throw you in jail. If he wanted your property, he would take your property, and you really didn't have any recourse. And that was pretty much the story. So, but John said, "Look, hey, you know what? If it worked for my brother, it's probably going to work for me." So, he continued to demand money and constantly demanded more money from from his people. Now, there's a couple of players in this story. In addition to John, you have the barons, aka the lords. And if you recall, in this fragmented time, uh, the lords, they kind of got land for loyalty, and so they had to have a certain amount of loyalty for their superior. They were vassals to a higher person, and that didn't mean they had to like that person. They just they had a legal obligation to fulfill this. So John's little pet project here was going back to France to regain the land that once belonged to his ancestors. Now, he had done this on a couple of different occasions, and every time he failed to decisively defeat the French. So now in 1213, he decided that he was going to do it again. So an invasion of France required many soldiers and more money. And so these lords or barons, they said, "Oh wow, you know what? This guy's going to throw us into another conflict, and it's going to cost us our lives and our wealth." And you know what? Many of the barons refused. They had little interest in John's quarrel with the French king. So enraged, John set out to punish them by attacking their castles. So of course they were not too pleased with this uh, either. So soon after returning to English soil in October of 1214, John resumed his demand for money from the rebellious barons. Those demands fell on deaf ears. Sensing John's weakness after his failure in France, he barons began to make their own demands, which is really, really unusual in this time period. In January of 1215, a group of these barons appeared before John, asking him for a written charter, basically a promise that he was going to return their lives to the way it used to be. We pay you because we're your vassals, but you're not going to make our lives so difficult that we really despise you. So John decided to stall for time. Okay, he would give the barons an answer later in the spring. In the meantime, John sent letters to enlist the support of the Pope. John's got a little fallback plan here. If I can get the Pope on my side, then these barons are going to fall into line here. So in April, the barons presented John with more specific demands, and John flatly rejected them. And he remarked famously, "Why do not the barons with these unjust exactions ask my kingdom?" In other words, you know, why don't I just give you everything? You want this, I might as well I'll give you everything. So, in response, the barons withdrew their allegiance to King John and started to form this rebel army. Okay, so now let me make this clear. Not all the barons were against John, but the 40 or so rebel barons and their forces held London as well as their own fortified castles throughout England. John commanded a slightly smaller force of loyalist barons and mercenaries. Unaligned were about 100 barons plus a group of church leaders headed by Archbishop Stephen Langton. Now, Langton was probably uh, one of the rebels himself. Okay, John commanded a slightly smaller force of loyalist barons and mercenaries, and so you know this all goes down at this place called Runnymede, which uh, is on the Thames River west of London. So this all comes to a head, and everybody said, "Look, we've got to settle our problems right now." So John and his supporters, the rebel barons, the neutrals, church leaders, and Langton all met at Runnymede on June 15, 1215. Significantly, and most importantly, while most of the king's fighting forces were scattered about, the rebels themselves appeared at full military strength. So, so they pretty much, John's. I think it's fair to say he's intimidated. Little is known about the details of this historic meeting. We do know that King John placed his seal of approval on a document called the Articles of the Barons. Then, over the next few days, these articles were rewritten, expanded, and put into the legal language of a royal charter. At some point, probably on June 19th, John put his seal on the final draft of what we call today Magna Carta, or this great charter. In exchange, the rebellious barons renewed their oath of allegiance to King John, thus ending the immediate threat of civil war. So it looks like everything is going to fall into place. So, what did the Magna Carta actually say? Well, the document itself is very complex, and they had basically 63 articles or chapters. Most of those concerned feudal law, which were important to the rebel barons, but are really of little relevance today. Other parts of the Magna Carta corrected King John's abuses of power against the barons, church officials, merchants, and other free men who together made up about 25% of England's population. Magna Carta thus virtually ignored the remaining 75% of the population. Probably the most famous part of the Magna Carta is Chapter 39, where it basically says that no man shall be seized or put in prison or stripped of his rights or possessions except by the lawful judgment of his equals by the law of the land. Now, some people confuse this with the idea of a trial by jury. This had nothing to do with trial by jury, but what it does really talk about indirectly is something that we call due process, which, in other words, every legal system is a process you have to go through. So you can't be arrested and then just sent to jail. You have to go through this legal process. You have to go before a judge. You can ask for bail. You can ask for an attorney, etc., etc. Which was, that's kind of what it's like today. So the purpose of this chapter was to prevent John from personally ordering the arrest and punishment of a free man without lawful judgment. So again, this Magna Carta was not really for everyone. Notice they said freemen. You see these other components in here. To no one will we sell. To no one will we deny or delay the right of justice. No, in our Constitution, that means you have a right to a speedy trial. Uh, you know, Again, the whole idea of this due process. So, the idea of the Magna Carta, it put limits on the king's power. It also made clear that the king was not above the law, but had to follow the law himself. These are the basic principles we call limited government and the rule of law, which we will talk about in our next chapter. So, Magna Carta of 1215 was not really intended to be a list of rights for Englishmen, okay, or even the barons themselves. It was more like a contract in which John bound himself to abide by its provisions. The barons only wanted King John to satisfy their complaints against his abusive rule, not overthrow the monarchy. Okay, they didn't want to overthrow him. Again, unintended consequence here. The real significance of this document lies in the basic idea that a ruler, just like everyone else, is subject to the rule of law. So when King John agreed to Magna Carta, he admitted that the law was above the king's will, which was a revolutionary idea in 1215. Now, John was not happy about signing this Magna Carta. And while he did satisfy some of the barons' personal grievances, he secretly wrote the Pope asking him to cancel Magna Carta on the grounds that he signed it against his will. In today's world, he would probably have an argument there. Signing something under duress is not legal. At the same time, he continued to build up his mercenary army. Now, the rebels, or the barons, not trusting John's intentions, they maintained their army in London. So he said, we're not going anywhere. Okay. We don't trust you. And, they started to, say to John that you defaulted on your agreement. And so this, at this point, they really start talking about this idea of getting him out of power. They even approached the French king, the son of the French king, to see if he would aid in their rebellion, and that he would come to their aid. Now, things looked like they were going to spiral out of control, and a long and bloody civil war loomed across England when suddenly King John died. A round of heavy eating and drinking apparently led to a case of dysentery, causing his death on October 18th, 1216. 10 days later, John's son, Henry III, who was 9 years old, he comes to the throne. He was crowned the new king of England. With John out of the way, the conflict gradually ceased, and less than a month after Henry was crowned, his supporters confirmed Magna Carta in his name. In other words, his advisors kind of went along with it. So this time, the contract of the charter received the approval of the Pope. So Magna Carta, carrying with it the idea of the rule of law, was reconfirmed a number of times over the next 80 years, becoming a foundation of English law. Eventually, Magna Carta would become the source of important legal concepts found in our American Constitution and Bill of Rights. Among these are the principle of no taxation without representation, the right to a fair trial under law. These foundations of our own constitutional system had their beginnings in a meadow beside a river almost 800 years ago.